I'm really excited about today's episode of Magic in the Room. Before we get started, I want to let you know about a learning opportunity available to everyone. Here at Purpose and Performance Group, we talk about purpose a lot. We want people to have a deep understanding of their purpose so they can live intentionally.
Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Chris Province.
And I'm Hannah Bradrud.
And I am Luke Freeman. And today we are continuing our three-part series about execution, specifically execution of our strengths and how our strengths can make us more productive. And so today in the hot seat is Hannah. Are you ready?
I think so.
Okay.
I may have to take a little time to prepare and study up first.
Foreshadowing. I like it. So Chris, remind us, why are we talking about strengths and how is that connected to execution?
Well, for one, it's much more effective to leverage strengths than it is to try to prop up weaknesses. I mean, I think when it comes to areas of opportunity, that's more like we create the awareness and we address it as we go through. Spending a ton of time trying to prop up areas where we're naturally wired to ignore, there's not a lot of payoff. But where we are naturally wired to perform in these areas of strength, when we focus on those, when we further develop those, the return that we can create and the value we deliver to others, the teams we're a part of and the organizations we participate with are exponential. So strengths-based approach, that's why we're talking about it. And what this whole process is about is we've kind of flipped through some competencies and looked at, what are the things that make Luke really productive? What are the things that make Hannah productive? What about Chris? And so these are voted on, like the two people that are not in the hot seats. Basically, we've got to say, this is what we perceive to be as Hannah's superpower. And when she shows up at her best, this is what allows her to perform. So that's kind of how we got here. These are the things, execution is everything that we learn and do, that's synced up with our system, our mindset, our roles, our purpose, our daily commitments. When you get to that level of execution, it's everything we learn and do. And that's a big space. So we have to be productive in that space. And so during our time today, we're going to talk about the thing that we see as Hannah's superpower and what makes her highly productive as she shows up at her best.
Yeah, and as a reminder, we're using this resource called FYI, which stands for Your Improvement. It's put out by Korn Ferry, big fans of Korn Ferry, and it has a list of 38 competencies that help us execute. And so, Hannah, your superpower, should you choose to accept it, you can push back, self-development. And so as FYI describes it, someone who is skilled in self-development is personally committed to and actively works to continuously improve themselves. They understand that different situations and levels may call for different skills and approaches. They work to deploy their strengths, and they also work on compensating for weaknesses and their limits. So as you hear that, what does that ring true for you? What stands out or what connects with you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely rings through. It rings true. As I think back, even as a really young child, I've been just fascinated with learning. I love to learn. Acquiring knowledge. I learned to read before I started school. I was enamored with stories and I would read books. I would just devour books. And I've always enjoyed learning new skills and learning new things. And as I think I've kind of grown and evolved as a human, that translates into this growth mindset where I'm always looking at, okay, I may not be really good at this yet, but I think I can learn it, at least if I have the interest, right? There has to be interest there. But I think that's how I've been able to kind of pivot between, different career paths, kind of reinventing my life in times of challenge, because I'm always looking at, okay, how can I learn something new from this situation? How can I be a little bit better at this thing called life, or this program, or this this skill that I perceive that I need to learn in order to be effective in my role?
Yeah, it's interesting, talking about being able to adapt and pivot. As I was thinking about what rang truest for me about you, there's another competency in here that basically is about adaptability. And I almost said, hey, I think that should be Hannah's superpower. But, hearing you mention that, I'm just curious, do you think that this ability and this superpower of self-development kind of enables your ability to adapt and pivot so quickly?
I think so. To me, they're very, very connected, right? And it's kind of a chicken and an egg conversation, because I do believe learning new skills and having that ability to learn nimble, pick up new skills, new situations does require some situational adaptability. And being able to adapt quickly in different situations also requires learning on the fly.
Yeah. So when you think about this as a strength, how much of this strength have you naturally just had? It's always been in your tool bag. You've always been able to pull out this self-development tool. And how much of it have you had to develop and invest in?
It's both. As I mentioned earlier, it's something that I remember. Some of my earliest memories are just being fascinated with listening to my parents having other grown-ups in the room and trying to, connect with what they're saying, and even inserting myself in really grown-up conversations that were way beyond me, but just this desire to be part of the conversation and to learn, and to experimenting with, teaching myself how to sew little clothes for my, Barbie dolls or whatever. But just self-development in terms of just being fascinated with learning new things, that's been innate in me. But I think as I became more aware of the role that mindset plays, right? Because I also shortchanged myself a lot when I was younger in saying, oh, I don't know this, or I don't feel confident in this. Or for example, when it came to sports, right? I just had this mindset that I wasn't good at that because it wasn't something I'd been exposed to a lot in the family I grew up in. So it wasn't an area that I sought to develop myself, right? But as I've become more aware of the role that mindset plays, I've been able to shift that and pivot, and became a runner, which wasn't part of my life before, right? And also learning skill athletically, learning to dance, learning to do different things that I didn't think were innate or natural, right? So that's where I've kind of applied that mindset that enables me to believe that it's possible, and then apply the practice to learn the skill.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that I noticed when, Luke, you mentioned adaptability. I think this idea of learning to learn has a lot of value. And once you have confidence in that ability, that, learning nimbly, now if I can learn nimbly, there's really not an unfamiliar situation. And that's something that I'll call out is how does it show up practically to me? Is it, Hannah, it never looks like you're in an unfamiliar situation. So regardless of where you're at, it always feels familiar. And best I can tell, it comes from this ability. I may not know what we're going to do here, but I've not known what we were going to do here a lot.
Yeah.
And every time I've learned my way through it.
Yeah.
and so at some point it just becomes the way, and we're going to figure it out. There's nothing here that we can't learn.
Yeah.
So
I think some of that comes a little bit from this experience of kind of being an outsider. When I was younger, I was a little bit more of an introvert and kind of a loner and didn't always feel like I fit in necessarily at school. My family was very different from other families in our neighborhood. And I just have this memory of myself kind of being on the outside of the crowd, watching and observing, but not really being in it, being part of it. And so I think part of that has followed me throughout my life, where I'm in a new or unfamiliar situation. I watch and observe a lot before. Now maybe I'm quicker to insert myself, but it comes from that sense of, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I'm going to pay attention and I don't think that was a conscious thing when I was younger, right? But I think that ability to watch and observe helps me to adapt and recognize whether I'm consciously doing it or not. I'm always looking for what I can learn in the situation.
Yeah, so let's talk about how this leads to execution and high performance. And I'll just say, what I see when I think about this as a superpower for you is that in our conversations with clients, and I'm sure people who have listened to the podcast know this, like you're always, well, as so-and-so says in this book, here's this statistic, or here's this truth about the way the brain works, or here's this truth about how you form a habit. It's just like all of these, super useful and practical applications that are just, they feel right on the tip of your tongue and ready to contribute to other people. And I think that makes it, I don't know, I feel like when we're in consulting conversations, getting to practical ways to help people, like you're just super fast because you've learned all of those things and applied them internally to yourself. It's not just, well, this says this. It's, well, this says this and I tried it.
Right.
And here was my experience.
Yeah. I mean, I've always loved to read. I'm actually a really slow reader. So part of, I think, how I've learned to overcome that slowness is that I discovered audiobooks years ago, but at first it wasn't something I connected with. I had a hard time just like listening and paying attention, right? I'm also a very visual learner. But I discovered, and this is part of, now I understand why, because I've studied the brain, but I discovered that if I'm doing something physically active, so moving my limbs that doesn't require concentration, I could actually focus on an audio book much more effectively than if I was just like sitting there trying to pay attention, right? So even just learning how to learn, like you mentioned, Chris, that's been, I think, part of how I'm able to execute learning at an accelerated speed, even though I'm actually a slow reader. I read, and I don't read nearly as many books as some people that, read like 100 books in a year or something. Mm-hmm. I kind of shoot for 50 a year, 52, about one a week. I probably fall somewhere between 30 and 40 every year. But that's kind of become a practice that I'm always listening to books at a little bit of an accelerated speed while I'm doing something else. So trying to optimize always my time, like learning something if I'm doing something that's passive.
Awesome. Yeah, it's this idea that, once you've put in the effort to learn how to learn, then think how much more mastery you can build. Mm-hmm. And the call for leaders is, here's something I want to call out. And you guys, I pick on this person a lot, and it's the person that's got this. Okay. Uh-huh. If you are a leader, or you know a leader that says, no, I've got this, like chances are we don't got this. Like, because what that statement says is there is nothing that I need to learn in order to address this situation. I got this.
Mm-hmm.
There's no variables in it that I haven't dealt with before. I've got this. And there are people that accept jobs to run entire organizations with the attitude of, I got this.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing is supposed to be sustainable, and have like upwards performance trajectory. And somebody in an office somewhere has got this. And so if you know that person, suggest that they listen to this episode and fast forward to the 15-minute mark.
Yeah, it's that.
So that they know Chris said we don't got this.
We don't got this. There's always something new to learn and to adapt to, right? And that reminds me of, I don't remember the quote exactly, but it's something to the effect of, the future belongs to the learners, because the learned will quickly find themselves in the world that no longer exists.
Mm-hmm.
So if we believe that we got this, whatever state things are at, and we got it, we're going to be obsolete in 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a quote here in FYI from John F. Kennedy. It says, leadership and learning are indispensable to each other.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that leaders are learners, it makes a ton of sense when you put it in the context that you just shared, that if we're going to move into the future and we're going to lead others into the future, like the future is unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's learning is implicit in that experience of being a leader. So,
and it's implicit in the idea of sustainability, right? So if we want our systems that we just bleed into and dump resource into, if we want them to be sustainable, like learning has to be wired into it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like to call out is the idea of persuasion, like one of those unlocking EQ skills. Like persuasion is really built on our character.
Yeah.
So between our character and our ability to communicate messages in the context of the audience.
Mm-hmm.
So much about being persuasive is about how we are perceived. More specifically, how do people read our character?
Right.
And the person who got this and their character perception versus the person who's willing to put whatever effort is needed to learn what they need to learn to succeed in any situation. Those two leaders have very different levels of persuasion.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability of those leaders to move a team is very different.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to be a persuasive leader, or you want to fill your organization with persuasive leaders, character development is mission critical. And this idea of learning and self-development is a primary contributing factor to how we are perceived.
Yeah.
All right. So we're getting ready to pivot into the most fun part of this episode,
It's the roast.
wherein we give Hannah a hard time for when she overuses her superpower of self-development.
Can't
but
wait.
first, our question of the day.
All right, welcome to our question of the day. This is when we talk about current events, maybe things we're engaging with, or just interesting questions to learn more about one another. Today, let's share a story. Share with me a story about something you've done recently that required courage.
Okay. Courage. Okay. I'll share a little bit of a vulnerable story. So, the thing that I did recently that required courage was book a 4-day camping trip with my family, like schedule it, pay for the site, all of that. So my kids had a couple days off school, and so I scheduled this, and we're going to go spend a longish time together. And why it required courage is probably the hard part, because it sounds like, well, that's easy. That sounds really fun. And I think people that know me are like,
especially with your family, right?
yeah, you guys love doing stuff like that, and it's perfect for you. But for me, why it required courage is I kind of have given myself this like 1 or maybe 2 like vacations a year. So like maybe in the summer I get a week, or maybe I can stretch it to a couple weeks if I work during one of them. And then like at Christmas, maybe I can string together 4 days, or something like that. And why those are the dates that are in my mind, I don't know. Like, it's very traditional. It's very much like, well, my family grew up like working very traditional jobs, and we didn't go places more often than that. And like security wise, financially wise, like I probably could spend more time not working. But it makes me feel really uncomfortable. It makes me feel vulnerable, and it makes me feel like, Luke, if you don't work harder than anyone else, then you're not going to be successful, or you're not going to be as secure as you want to be. And so like I knew they had these days off school, and I was like I only have a few years left, like with my oldest still in school. And like we're starting to have these conversations of like, how are we actually spending quality time together, and what does that look like? And so for me, it was like a values choice. It was a purpose choice. It was a prioritization choice. And I don't really, I'm not very tortured about, is it the right choice or not? But I also am honest that it's hard for me to not work a lot, because there is that source of right, wrong. How could I ever expect to be successful without working a lot? A lot of those things that I really have to, face, think about, reflect on, to be able to be who I want to be.
It's interesting because it's not just Western culture, it's very much American culture, that whole mindset that I can only be successful, or I will only be perceived as someone of value if I work myself to the bone, and that I spend every waking hour every day working. Otherwise, people aren't going to think I'm productive. And it's so different where I grew up in Norway. People do work hard, and there are people that are very successful and that accomplish great things. And at the same time, it's 100% legit to take 5 weeks off a year and go on vacation and completely unplug and be unavailable. And there's a system in place where there are interns or temps or people that are ready and willing and able to step into a role for a whole summer, right? To be a temp for somebody who's away on vacation. Now, there are levels to that. Obviously, if you are a very high level executive, depending on the scale of the operation, you may still have to be available some of that time. And at the same time, there's also just culturally accepted that when you're on vacation, you're away, you're gone. We're not depending on you. We've built a system that's resilient enough that we have resources that can cover when somebody's away.
Yeah.
So build a less efficient system, and you can take off all you want.
I would say build a more efficient system, and everyone can be healthy and operate in their full strength for longer.
Yeah. So that's my story of courage. Chris, how about you?
Well, being that there's a 1 in 107 chance of dying in a car accident, I felt pretty courageous getting in the car and driving to the studio today.
Really?
That is a type of courage, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think about that when you get in the car as much as you
Yes.
drive?
Every time I get on an airplane, every time I get in the car, I have this strange obsession with like death and like
ways to die.
I don't want to die.
Yeah.
So, you know, like, while I am very aware of all the things, right? And I think, you know, I remember back when I had my gallbladder removed, like I went like a year because I didn't want to know what was wrong. So then I didn't go to the doctor, and I almost died because I didn't go to the doctor in time. So then it was like an emergency. Then they had trouble getting it out, and it turned into a whole thing, right? But yeah, like I'm sitting there going, oh man, like this is bad. I think I have cancer. If I have cancer, I don't want to know. I don't want to die. So if I don't go to the doctor, I don't have to admit that I might die. So all those things, right? And so I don't think, like, it doesn't lock me up. It's like, I love life. I feel like I have a lot of things left undone. So, you know, like that courage just to face that every day, that's the truth. And maybe if I was a little more stoic about it, I would say things live and things die. And it should be that fact of life should be easily accepted because it's that way with every living thing. But yeah, it's just something I think about a lot.
All right. Well, we're glad you had the courage to get in the car and join us in the studio today.
Yeah, that part was a little tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, 1 in 107. Don't get locked up by that. That's a hell of a number, though.
Yeah, those are not awesome odds, really.
No, they're not.
All right. Well, I'm going to share a story of really why being on video requires courage for me. And these days I do it a lot, so I don't think about it as much, and it doesn't quite take as much of an act of courage. But I was chatting with Alicia on our production team here yesterday as she's, you know, adjusting the studio cameras. And it turns out we share a similar background. We went to the same college, and I started out as a production major. She graduated just this last year as a production major, TV production major. And so I think I've shared parts of this on the podcast before, but I essentially grew up in a TV studio. My dad ran a radio and TV station. And so from the time I was probably 5 or 10 years old, this was a regular part of my life, you know, to hang out at the studio. I loved watching the radio techs cutting tape, you know, and editing radio programs. And I also pretty early started helping with running the studio cameras. I was always more comfortable behind the camera, though. I have a sister who was always the on-screen talent. But the story I shared with Alicia yesterday was one of the reasons, not the main reasons, but a contributing factor to why I changed my major from TV production to communication, was when I watched the first video of myself anchoring a news story for my Intro to TV Production course, which I, by the way, I had to take twice, and I flunked it twice. That was another factor that I decided maybe this isn't for me. And here's part of the reason. I was so uncomfortable watching myself on video, and the self-talk that I told myself as I was watching it, the critical voice that really took hold, that I still remember. I remember exactly what I was wearing in that little video from 20 plus years ago. I remember how I perceived myself showing up and how critical I was. And literally the story was, you're really not good at this. You suck at this. You should not be doing. What are you wearing? Why are you even wearing that? It looks silly. You don't have the talent to do this. This is not for you. And that voice stayed with me for decades. And so anytime I would have somebody would show up with a camera, especially a video camera, I would kind of freeze up and I would get really self-conscious and uncomfortable. And it's just in recent years I've chosen to face that fear and have some courage and do the video thing, even though it felt really uncomfortable. So I'm doing it here again. And I just spent the day in the studio yesterday recording a bunch of videos for a course that we offer. And the more I do it, the more comfortable I get, and maybe the less courage it requires. But that took a lot of courage for me to kind of just face that fear and be comfortable being uncomfortable and being okay with not being perfect on camera. And I don't know why I got that into my head, that what perfection was or why that was important. And those are some of the things I coach young women on now, is like this whole, where does your identity come from? What is image versus what is true? And how to be more authentic in the way we show up, which is not being perfect.
Right. I think there's a lot of that, I can refer to as like beautifully flawed. Like everyone has them.
Right.
Right. And if you are a person that doesn't outwardly have a flaw, then what's pacing through our head, right? If we don't have that outward flaw, like it's all in there. And it's just
how hard is it for people to relate to someone that doesn't have any outward flaws?
Sure. Yeah. And we all have them. And so thank you guys for kind of facing those. And that's kind of the takeaway here, is like, if you turn to them and you face them, man, it becomes a lot easier.
Yeah.
And it goes back to that idea, like life is hard, right? The sooner we accept it, the easier it becomes. So like leaning into these things and going head on and courageously booking the trip with my family, even though there's something in my DNA that says I should be working, right? Like, hey, I want to try this. I want to lean in. It's not traditional. And to say like, yeah, I'm good with being on video a lot. I'll do the podcast, I'll do the online courses, I'll do, all the video facilitation. So, I mean, I think that's the thing, is turning head on into the things that we fear and having a richer life because of it. And if we can inspire anyone to just take one step towards something that they're fearing, then I think we all win. So thank you guys for listening to today's question of the day. Now we'll get back to the show.
All right. We are back talking about Hannah's superpower of self-development. And Hannah, can I just read a list of what FYI says could happen if you overuse this superpower?
Fair.
Maybe a self-help development junkie. Can lead to navel gazing. Nasal gazing is more fun.
What is
Can't
this
relate.
word?
Navel gazing.
Navel gazing.
Like looking at your own belly button?
Yeah.
Have you not ever heard that expression?
No.
Really?
So basically,
I had
Well,
to
let
look
me
up the word
educate you.
induce. So, yeah.
can lead to too much introspection.
Gotcha.
Is that better?
How's your belly button in introspection?
You're just looking at yourself.
Okay. But
Yeah.
you're talking about inward,
Yeah.
not like your actual belly button.
No.
Well, the analogy could
metaphor.
be the
Okay,
inward
we'll get
mindset.
to your
Is
weaknesses
it a metaphor
on the
or a
next episode,
platitude?
Chris. Okay, I'm going to start over. So, if your superpower is overused, it could look like potentially being a self-help development junkie, too much thinking about yourself and your own development. You may confuse others with your constant efforts to improve and change. So they might think like, who's the Hannah I'm going to get today? You may be too self-centered, may be susceptible to self-help fads, and may spend too much time improving and too little time acting and performing. Okay.
I can't relate to any of those. I don't know where this is coming
Well,
from.
let me help you out.
Okay, we're going to have
Chris,
to
you're
spell
so
it out.
helpful.
So some of those do not apply. Okay.
Okay.
Like, fair enough. Like I don't, definitely like not subject to self-help fads, right? But
Yeah, I don't
yeah.
necessarily relate to that
Yeah.
word, but
but in a sense, like there's this whole like always be developing approach. And so I think some of those things don't always strike me as synced, but they don't have to be, do they? I mean, like if you want to learn how to grow a garden of roses, learn how to grow a garden of roses.
Right.
It doesn't have to be aligned. We can just develop for the fun of it. But I think it's creating the awareness that if I'm really trying to do if I'm not trying to grow a garden of roses, do I really need to understand how to do it? Or should that be where my effort's directed?
Yeah, and I think there's not always, I think so if you are someone who's really interested in learning and self-development, almost anything is interesting because someday that skill might be useful, right? But I may not have a use for it right now, but I bet you I can draw on it at some point. So it's not always linear. And I do think in a performance organization, right, there can definitely be a distraction. And whereas, it's a strength in execution when you really apply yourself to learn. For example, we're learning organization, and I felt it was very important for us to get into the online learning space. And so I spent hours and hours learning how to use a online learning software tool, right, that we didn't have in our skill set on our team. And that took, it takes a lot of time to learn a new skill. It requires a lot of energy. It's not always the most efficient but it can be effective. And so, being aware of that, but also not get distracted by, oh, this is so interesting. I want to spend hours and hours learning this thing if it's not necessarily strategic or helping our organization perform.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I heard you saying is that the reward for learning is the experience of learning.
Yeah.
And so you can go down this path where like any shiny object of, hey, I could learn how to do that, almost becomes too big of a pull and could distract you from your purpose, whatever you're trying to execute on.
100%, at least distract me from the goal at hand, right? Because, like that's why writing papers took so long, because I was researching every rabbit trail of threads that I could get into because it's interesting.
Right.
But it may not apply or help me with this particular.
I specifically remember, Hannah, like these papers were not done until they had to be placed in the Dropbox. Like if it was due at 10, 9:59 is when the paper was done.
Yeah. And we were lucky if it was actually done
this
then.
This would be like after working on the paper literally for 3 weeks. So there's no procrastination involved. Only continuous learning and addition for 3 weeks.
Yeah. I mean, I don't procrastinate. I just learn new things.
Like wash the words 100 times, resequence the paragraphs, should this concept go in place of that concept?
And if I'm going to write one paragraph about this one thing that relates to the paper, I got to read several volumes on it in order to make sure I fully understand it before I can actually put it in the paper.
Socialize the concept, work through those. So, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of like how it shows up in practice. Like, again, not good, not bad, right? As all very good papers, all 50 versions were excellent,
Or the one version that just took.
But like for the we'll say the professor, like the difference between version 1 and version 50 there probably was not material relative to grade. Okay. But for you, there's a big difference between like your level of understanding at version 1 is much different than the level of understanding at version 50.
Oh yeah. I mean, I was the person in undergrad who would gladly take a letter grade cut in my grade for turning the paper in late because I knew it was the best paper I could write and it was how the paper needed to be. And so I would sacrifice the grade for both the experience of writing the right paper and for getting it right. And that took as long as it took. It did not follow any artificial deadline that was set by the professor.
Or the university.
Or the university.
Like, I relate with the university's deadline of, no, seriously, you do have to finish this semester. I'm like, not if I don't want to finish this semester. Like, my material is not ready.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I have not birthed the baby yet.
This may also be why I don't have the letters MA behind my name today, even though we all spent the same amount of time in the same graduate program.
True fact.
True fact. But I sure learned a lot.
We learned the same stuff, Anna.
And have I not applied every ounce of that learning in our work together?
Yeah.
Yeah. So any of those other overused skills stand out to you as like, oh yeah, that one hits a little close to home?
You want to read a specific one?
No, I'm gonna let Hannah choose.
So this is related to what we just talked about, but focuses on own development at the expense of meeting other obligations. So if the obligation is a deadline, I sometimes fall short of deadlines or fall way long on deadlines because, and that's something I have to, that's an area of, often our greatest strengths can be our greatest weakness, right? So that's an area of weakness that I've always been aware of, tried to develop, right? Where sometimes I have to sacrifice the learning experience or getting it perfect, right? Or getting it right in order to get the thing done enough, right? Because in my mind, something is never done. That's that whole, that's maybe part of the overuse of self-development. But in my world, there isn't a done, really. There's only better, right? And so there's always a continuum. So being able to recognize what is the obligation I have to fulfill in this assignment or this role, right? And being able to meet those obligations without going overboard with the learning.
Yeah. So how do you manage that? I mean, what skill have you had to develop to have discernment on that?
Part of that is developing some detachment of not getting too personally involved in the process or the learning or the even attachment to an outcome. The role itself,
right? Because
too.
I think there's this idea of competing priorities, learning or doing, but then like it's the idea of role exploration versus role acceptance. There's the roles that I've accepted and the roles that I'm exploring, and they're two different types of learning.
Yeah.
So if I'm a learner, I learn more about something I'm trying to develop a very technical mastery in, the role that I've accepted versus the role I'm exploring, which is still nascent and it's more exciting. It's like that first relationship, right? The first month of a relationship where it's like, man, this is great. I just want to spend as much time doing this as I can. And like it calls in a different way. So you not only end up with competing priorities within a specific role, but you end up with competing roles when you're a high self-developer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on too, the whole novelty and someone who loves to explore new ideas, new things, right? I'm much better at building something new than maintaining something that exists because it engages me in a different way, right? So once I get to mastery, it's not as interesting anymore. And that's ironic because you're learning so you can be more effective at a thing. But once you've figured out how to be effective at a thing, you're ready to move on to the next thing.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Hannah, for sharing your superpower. And I think for folks listening, you can really imagine how you would take this conversation and continue to move it forward into, well, what projects could you work on that would be effective? And what areas could I give you support to have really clear expectations around things so you don't spend a lot of time on something that maybe I, as your supervisor, wouldn't want you to, you know? So we can go into all of these, taking this conversation, moving it towards practicality with the people that we work with and coach and mentor. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us today. If you have questions, you want to connect with Hannah or Chris and I, you can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. We're going to be back next week, and Chris is going to be in the hot seat, and we're going to talk about one of his superpowers. And
notice you said one of them, plural.
We
that
know,
remains to
Chris,
be seen.
All right.
You're full
We
of
haven't assessed you
superpowers.
yet
Okay.
fully. Okay, so yeah, thanks so much for joining today, and we'll see you next time on Magic in the Room.
Thanks, guys.
Have a great day.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bretterow, and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love, available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.